All right. Welcome everyone to, I believe this is episode 4 of the Kistic Chat. And today we're going to talk about Nordic things and heathen things and all types of things. So I would like to first introduce Luke. They're going to be our speaker, our main speaker. We're all going to be speaking and talking and having a good time and all that stuff. But Luke is going to head the presentation for us. Luke, tell us a little bit about your background and things like that.
Yeah, hey everybody. My name's Luke Babb. I use they, them pronouns. I am a polytheist spirit worker. Um, and, you know, I am here today because I work a lot with the Norse pantheon in a fairly hard polytheist sort of way. But I also work with the Hellenics and the spirits of the Fellowship of the Phoenix, which is a queer organization here in Chicago and also over in Seattle. And I am sure that you'll hear more about me soon. We also have Amy here today. Amy, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Sure, thank you so much. I am Amy Alice, but I am better known on YouTube as Ruby Ruse. I have a YouTube channel there where I talk primarily about the Fae, which I equate with non-human entities that are not necessarily gods, but they are not human either. And just very active in the pagan community. I am very excited about this particular topic because I have always been fascinated with heathenism. I am third generation Scandinavian from Denmark. So that really speaks to me, and the runes are a part of my spiritual practice as well. So I'm so excited about this talk today.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It seems like, in the 80s and the Chinese heathenism had an upsurge, and then all of a sudden it got quiet for a few years because I noticed things in paganism become in vogue, and then in the 90s and early 2000s, it was everything was Celtic. The Fae, the Celts, this, and this, and then it was a shift to like traditional witchcraft. And now it's so funny because I keep seeing both of Celtic spirituality and then heathen spirituality. And because of social media, we're talking more, we're getting a lot more online ceremonies. I've been seeing all types of things. So, Luke, why don't you take it away and let us know what's going on?
What's going on in heathenry? A topic that would take, I think, a lot more than an hour.
Well, tell us about heathenry. So for those of us who kind of heard it, but we're not quite sure about the mythology, we're not quite sure about the cosmology. What is that, first of all?
Right. And that's also a fairly good place to start because I feel like that's one of those questions that you could get a lot of different answers to. For the purposes of today, what I am talking about is I consider heathenry to be people who work with deities or spirits in the Germanic pantheon, which means that these people would have come out of lands in like Germany, Scandinavia, all the way over to Iceland and Greenland, pretty much before 1000. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of different spirits. And it's a lot of different ways for people to interact with them. So within heathenry, sort of like paganism, you get all sorts of different practices. You get people who are spirit workers and work pretty extensively with individual spirits and think of those as like real living relationships. You also get people who are much more on the side of like research and like understanding a worldview from a time period in the past. Some of those people are doing it as a way to like understand their own heritage. Some of those people are doing it as a way to sort of contextualize other parts of their lives. But that's sort of what I would call heathenry. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So tell us about the cosmology. Who are the gods? What do heathens believe in? Things like that.
Great. Yeah, so you're gonna, most of the people here are going to have heard the names of some of the gods because heathenry and Norse mythology, kind of like the Greeks, have some big name like characters, right? The one that usually comes up first is Odin, the Allfather, the Wanderer, the Old Man, as I mostly affectionately call him. You get Thor, the Thunderer, the friend of man. You get Loki, my personal favorite, who has many names. We'll call him the trickster right now. There's Freya, the goddess of beauty and light, and Freyr, her brother, the god of fertility, for lack of a better term. All of these gods are like big name drops. More generally, and again, I promised you that I would say some like things that other heathens will pick fights on me on. Here's where it starts. So there are three major groups of gods in heathen mythology, right? There's the Aesir. That's where Odin's from. They are often the characters that are telling the stories in the myth. There's the Vanir. That was another tribe of gods who at one point had a major war with the Aesir. Some of the Vanir are now living with the Aesir as not prisoners, people who make sure that the Vanir and the Aesir don't have a fight again. There are also some Aesir over in the Vanir camp doing the same. And then there are the Oulton. The Oulton get a bad name in heathenry with a lot of folks because they are a little bit more like Titans. If you're more familiar with Greek mythology, they are the people who are of the land. In a sort of like mountains are of the land, volcanoes are of the land, massive tidal waves are of the land sort of way. They are not necessarily as easy to understand as the Aesir, who are often characterized as being more like civilization, or the Vanir, who are often characterized as being more like agricultural. So Aesir, you've got Odin. Vanir, you've got people like Freyr and Freya. Jotun, you've got people like Aegir, the god of the sea, or Angrboda, who is a character that is very much of like wolves and the wild forest. And all three of these groups are sort of enmeshed. Most people are descended from the Jotun. Lots of them marry into the Aesir. Lots of them marry into the Jotun. But they're also all sort of in conflict, which is sort of an overview of how the different groups are. As for the cosmology, that's a very complicated question.
Well, as much as we can, like simplify and talk about, the three worlds, which are broke up into nine, and what that means.
Sure. So I would actually start explaining the cosmology by explaining the world tree, Yggdrasil. If you run into Norse mythology in any form, I am currently playing God of War and really enjoying it. Yggdrasil is the thing that connects all of the worlds. It is a giant tree at whose roots the fates have their well, and in whose branches the different worlds live, right? There are 9 worlds. I could rattle them off. I don't think I need to necessarily. The 9 worlds are different sorts of places where different sorts of people live. And they're a useful way to start talking about the different kinds of spirits that exist. So like Amy, we talked about this a little bit in your earlier episode about the Fae. There are things called the Elves. So there's Svartalfheim and Lothelfheim. I am mangling all of these pronunciations, friends, and I am sorry about it. So the Dark Elves and the Light Elves, who both have their own lands. There's Vanaheim, where the Vanir are from. There's Asgard, where the Aesir are from. There's Jotunheim, right? You're starting to see like all of these people come from different places. And the way these places interact starts to kind of tell you how the people interact. There's Helheim. I think that that's sort of what you were gesturing towards with your 3 different worlds, right? Helheim and Niflheim are where some of the dead go. Like I said, it's a complicated place, but that's sort of the map.
So it's interesting because you and I don't shy away from pagan controversy. And, you know, part of my own spiritual practice is I do a little bit of heathenism, but more specifically, it's witchcraft heathenism, because it's just part of how I was trained in traditional craft was very Anglo-Saxon. And so when I started my own group, having a strong heathen background, I did a whole lot of research, especially with things like Save and things like that, to where, and I do want to talk about Save, but for myself, it made sense to me, and it just really resonated with me. So what I want to talk about today, if we can, I want to talk about the things that you're not supposed to talk about because some guy who is heathen said don't. And you know how I feel about that. I'm like, I hate gatekeeping. And anybody who knows me knows I hate it. I hate everything about it. There's a difference between telling a person, "Oh, you're not there yet, but once you are, I'm happy to help you get there," versus I'm not telling you the mystery. So I would love to talk about heathen witchcraft, say stuff like that. Loki, of course. Hella, like all the things I tell is don't talk about. Let's do it. Let's be bad.
I mean, you're talking to the right person. Yeah, another thing that I really want to talk about, Laura Gonzalez is usually with us in these groups. She had a couple of questions that she wanted to bring up. She wasn't able to come today. I definitely, is it all right if I start a little bit about where heathenism comes from?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah. So Laura's question, which I think is a question a lot of people run into when they start thinking about heathenism, is why are there so many racists using these symbols? And what are you doing about that? Which is why I love Laura so very deeply much.
Absolutely, we love her.
So I am actually going to point y'all, if this is a question that is really interesting to you, there is a wonderful podcast that comes out of the Troth called Heathen History that goes into this in more detail. A brief recap is this. A lot of heathenism comes out of Germanic nationalism originally. That's just where it comes from. Back in the day when Germans were trying to form their own identity, one of the ways that they were doing that was in researching their older religious background, right? And so that is a thing that we are all going to have to deal with. People originally started looking at these myths, writing them, researching them as a way to say, this is who we are not these other people. Not a bad thing in and of itself. It ended up having some good research. Unfortunately, in the early 1900s, we know where Germanic heathenism, Germanic nationalism went, right? And it went in a direction that involved a lot of things that you would recognize today in white nationalism. That the difficulty in coming to heathenry and being drawn by these myths and by these spirits is that there are people who are also drawn by them, who use them for ends of hate speech and division. There are people in heathenry that believe that only folks of Germanic descent can speak to these deities. That is actually a Christian idea from the 1700s, but it's been taken by heathenry now. Congratulations, we're all so lucky. So, like, part of navigating being a heathen, especially in America, kind of primarily in America, is interacting with communities that are also doing heathen things, but are doing them for really gross reasons. And as a heathen in America, you've, one, got to learn how to recognize those guys. And two, one of the really great things that has come out of heathenry recently is something called Declaration 127. It's based off of the Havamals, which is one of the, it's one of our holy texts. It's the saying of Oulton. One of the pieces of wisdom that gives us is when you see an enemy, call him by name and give him no peace. So a lot of how I navigate heathenry, a lot of how the people that I am with in heathen community navigate heathenry is looking for those people, very clearly saying that is not what heathenry is about. That is not what we are here to do, and we are not going to tolerate it in our spaces. Which I think is good work, and I think has prepared me to do that sort of work in other spaces as well. But to answer Laura's question, that's why there are racists. It's because that there's a long history of racism in heathenry, and it's especially American heathenry. And one of the things that we are doing is trying to make it very clear that that's not what we're about. And also, like, separate our symbols and our myths from their work. Some of that we have lost. Some of that is just not going to happen. The swastika was originally a heathen symbol. It's gone. We're not using it anymore.
One of the things, and so what I want to just kind of clarify is a few things. The symbol of the swastika itself, it's actually it's essentially a bind rune of the sun. It's two suns, and the Nazi regime and things like that, they were trying to find power. And they were trying to find, not just with heathen power or with the runes, they were trying to find any power. The other thing is that I would hope people will understand and do a little research. That same symbol is also a symbol that you see in Hinduism and Buddhism, and has nothing to do with Nazis and stuff like that. So, and I think that a lot of people in this country have been very good about, when they see it on, say, a Buddhist temple or their art, they don't associate the two, which I'm very grateful for. The other thing is one of the things that I talk with my friends who are people of color is this, that as white people, as predominantly white people, and we may have other DNA in us, whatever, as predominantly white people, it's our job to clean our own house. You know, and I say this to Christians too, it's your job to clean your house. You can't say, this is not me, this is not us, it's the other. It's our job to clean our own house. It's kind of like if you have an alcoholic uncle who's causing havoc, it's the family's job to take care of it. Same thing. So one of the things I want to point out is that I feel like heathenry is one of the most, so the races and heathenry are very vocal, but I've also, and I'm not trying to downplay it in any way, shape, or form. I want to point out that in many traditions, there's racism, many. However, I
Yeah.
feel like, I'm not sure if it's just, heathens can be very vocal about what they believe, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes that's not so great, you know.
Well, I
But
cannot argue that we're not vocal people after I just like monologued about something for a while. So yes, that's true.
Well, I'd like to ask you a little bit more, like you mentioned the swastika and how that symbol is now gone. And what's interesting is that I did get into just a small debate with a person that said they were heathen about the swastika symbol. And I'm like, I know that it was appropriated by the Nazis. I do understand that. And I do understand what Chris was saying, that this is a symbol that features not only in heathenry, but it is also found in Hellenistic symbology. It's found in Buddhist symbology. It's a symbol of humanity. But it's not something that you can put on a t-shirt anymore.
Right.
If you do it that way, it's too much. The modern context is just too associated with Nazism, and that has become their symbol. And I said to the heathen person, wouldn't it be better if you want to work with that symbol to do it privately and use it in the way that it was being used, rather than forcing it upon the rest of the populace that isn't necessarily heathen? Wouldn't it be better to think of other people beyond yourself? And they wanted nothing to do with that argument. So I'd kind of like to hear from you, like, because you said that symbol is gone. So what do you think about that? Is that?
I think you have a very good point. And I think that this is all sort of like talking about around the same issue, which is also one of our commenters just asked about people of non-European descent using the runes, right? Here's what I believe. I believe that spirits are accessible to whoever wants to talk to them. And that includes the spirit of the runes, right? I believe that there should not be any sort of ideological or physical difference between people accessing a religion based on the color of their skin or their ancestry. I also think that, to your point, Chris, paganism generally in America is a very white predominant group. Like, there are lots of white people in paganism. And there have to be historical reasons for that, right? I think that there are a lot of reasons that America has come out that way. I think that there are a lot of sort of like background pieces to why we are this way now. And I think that in order to make ourselves more accessible to people of color, we need to start doing work internally on what sorts of like structural racism have we encoded in our groups already? What sorts of things are we using that make people feel unsafe? What sorts of ways are we talking that are problems for folks, right? And even just asking those questions and looking internally, doing sort of, I think, for me, that's a wider version of shadow work.
I agree.
Yeah.
One of the things, because, you know, So I started privately in witchcraft and paganism in about 1992, and I started to do it publicly in 2000. Um, what I've found is and I'm being general here, and so before we get hate mail about this from people, I am speaking from very generally, and I'm also speaking to my own experience. Um, there's a lot of white privilege and paganism. And the thing is that I have to be honest, it wasn't until so for a lot of my friends who are African American and Latino sat me down and explained it to me. And, and my friends are very caring and loving. And they were like, okay, I can tell you don't know. Let me explain it to you. And it was world changing because I didn't know. That in itself is called white privilege because
Yeah.
I had no clue. And the white privilege is that I get the idea that, oh, I'm half Irish. I'm not half Irish, but if I was, I'm half Irish. So I want to explore my Celtic roots. That's great. I'm German. I want to explore my German roots. That's great. But what happens is that because a lot of people who don't have that background feel isolated. And a lot of people and if you go, especially in like 2000, 2005, if you're like, I want to check out the public pagan groups, white, I mean, granted, there's things I know here in Chicago. I know that there's a group that celebrates Ifa and voodoo and things like that in Santeria and things. But predominantly, especially when you go to a public ritual that's blanketed pagan or open to all pagan, that's very white,
And I think that one of the important things that you said there is like blanketed pagan, right? Because I think that there's a meaningful difference between, and Laura's talked about this before, specific religions of closed religions of ancestry of people of color, right? So like if you practice Ifa, you're not necessarily going to identify as pagan. You're going to identify as somebody who practices Ifa, because that is a very specific thing. Paganism in America is much wider, and America culturally, when that sort of stuff happens, if it's a dominant narrative, it's probably going to be tied to whites' supremacy and privilege. Like that's a longer conversation. I'm going to point towards two books right now. I'm going to point towards the book White Fragility, and then I'm going to point towards a book called Color of Compromise, which goes into the history of American religion in relationship to racism. Both of them are amazing. Both of them, I think, should be read by folks who want to do this sort of work. I also want to pivot back to your question, though, because I don't think I actually ever answered it. So the question specifically of the swastika, right, is one that comes up a lot in heathen spaces. As you have already gathered, heathens are a contentious bunch, and nobody's going to agree on everything. My stance is that you're absolutely right. The swastika is culturally known as a symbol of hatred. Using it, no matter the religious significance to you, inflicts that experience on other people. Don't use it around other people. I would say don't use it at all, but I can't like tell you what to do with your life. I guess I feel like I should, but I can't.
I also want to say that there are so many different things that we can do besides that symbol. There are a bajillion different bind runes that we can do that are equally as good, if not better, than that symbol. And my grandfather's Jewish, so I have Jewish blood. No matter about the religious so-and-so, my other, whatever, a good chunk of my family is Jewish. I don't like that symbol, but I understand the progression, how it became what it is. But I would never, I mean, I always think of it this way. Who is, would I be arrogant enough to display that symbol to people it had either has harmed or has the potential to harm in the future? Like, to be honest, I think it's arrogance. I mean,
Yeah. And I want to reiterate again that we are talking about this symbol in terms and like in context of American pagan heathenry, right? Like that's a very specific context. It's a very Western context. I am not talking about this in terms of like Buddhism. I am not talking about this in terms of any Eastern traditions. I am, however, talking about it in terms of like American culture, right? And
right.
like there are people in the heathen community who also trace this back to very, very old, because heathenry, again, unlike Hellenic practice, we basically have some pots we dug up and 2 books that we found in somebody's barn. That's what we've got. That's what we're working with. It's more complicated than that, but like essentially that's how we're building a tradition. And we have found some pots with this symbol going way, 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 way back, talking about like this as a symbol of the sun, and a very powerful one. If you love the sun that much and you want to harness the power of the sun, may I suggest another symbol? There are so many. May I suggest a good Capri Sun packet hung above your altar? Like there are other options than this to do the work that you're trying to do.
And just also to be clear, there is a rune, so Ulo, by itself it looks like an S, and you can use that rune by itself, and it's great and it's beautiful. It just means the sun. That's all it means. So I'm trying to keep us on time, and I think to be honest, I think this is a topic that we could talk about and should talk about for hours and hours and hours. But for the sake of timing, let's talk about some other things we're not supposed to talk about. Let's talk about queerness and heathenism with Freyr and magic and scythe and all kinds of stuff.
Listen.
You're like, I'm going to take a breath.
I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to take a moment. I'm so excited about this. Let's do that thing. I mean,
I want to know what is the most controversial thing that you are just dying to talk about.
Oh gosh, I've already talked about the most controversial thing a lot. Let's talk about queerness, actually. I think that first one, I really am excited about that first one, because I think, like, again, I work with the Hellenic pantheon and I work with the Norse pantheon. Lots of people know Hellenic myths. If you know Hellenic myths, you know that a lot of people in them are very gay. The Norse have them beat. Okay. To the point that like there is an entire kind of magic that Chris has been name dropping, scythe, that is based on it is the idea that like women have power that is their own, and in order for men to have that power, they kind of got to be gay. I will cite my sources now. So scythe is, again, this very important feminine power that involves shape-shifting and knowledge of the future. In certain heathen context in like modern tradition, it has very specific meanings. So if you run into a heathen from, for instance, the Seattle area, and they start talking to you about scythe, they are talking about a specific kind of channeling work, probably coming out of the work of Diana Paxson. If you are talking to somebody who came up in the 90s, say there's probably something about shaking the body in order to jolt yourself into a trance state. That's different. That's a different practice. In the original texts, save is a thing that women do in order to see the future, kind of, to get knowledge of the things that their group should do. It's also tied to like out of body experience, possibly shape shifting. We have a very few men who know how to do save. Odin is one of them. Loki's another. I think that there's another guy in the sagas somewhere. If one of our illustrious colleagues wants to put that in the comments.
Which suggests that they're bisexual.
I mean, it does
Loki
more than
is.
suggest.
Loki is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very specifically tied to a word that is either ergi or arger or rager in the myths and in Old Norse. To the best of my knowledge, that word is tied very specifically to the act of receiving sexual penetration. Right? For Odin, it means. Sorry, Chris, say that again.
That's something I think we may want to clarify for people who don't know. In history, there was a difference to the male hetero mentality of basically being the penetrator and the receiver, because as a penetrator, you're still straight, sex is sex. But to be receptive was a whole different story. So when you say the receptor or the receptee, I don't know. I think that's where all of a sudden we get into the whole queerness or gayness, if you will.
Yeah, that's also, so there's a great article, it's actually available online. It's by Carol J. Clover. It is specifically about this idea of ergi and arger. And she posits that the idea of like gender in Old Norse is more along the lines of active to passive rather than male to female, right? So like a woman might start out as passive, but then she can move to more active, which is how you get warrior women. And a man theoretically starts out more active, but then can be injured in battle, uh, get older, he can move more passive. This idea of ergi is, it was, if you called another man ergi, it's one of the few things that you could be killed for. It was a huge big deal because it takes you all the way down to passive, right? It like strips you of this whole kind of identity. Also, it's the only way to do save. So there's this, I think, in Norse mythology, there's this very complex understanding of what gender is and where power comes from. And the really powerful mages in the mythology, so Odin, Loki, Freya, all practice this specific kind of magic. And I mean, Loki is easy to pick on because, you know, we all know what Loki gets up to in his spare time. But Odin is also a very queer figure. And you're right, Chris, you mentioned Freyr. Freyr, historically, what we know of Freyr's cult is that he was also like associated with ideas that like archaeologists are going to call cross-dressing, but ideas of people who we might recognize as like assigned male at birth today, doing worship while wearing female coded garments as his priesthood, right? So there's this whole, like, I think, much more interesting way of understanding mythology in the Norse setting that is inherently queer and ties queerness to power.
I want to talk about that for just a second because um, I'm not sure how many people know, but I'm part Cherokee, and so I study extensively with the Apache and the Lakota, and I've been studying it forever, a long time. And some tribes have something, not all, but some of them, what we have branded now called the Two Spirit. You know, and the Two Spirit just simply means that they are both male and female energetically. And so the idea is because they hold the power of Mother Earth and Father Sky at the same time, then there's something very sacred about them. And oftentimes, again, every tribe has their own way of doing things and blah, 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 blah. But oftentimes when they would see a child go against the gender norms, like, oh, they're in two worlds at once. And so there's more power there. Um, what I don't want people to take away from this conversation is, if I'm a heterosexual, does that mean I don't have power? No, that's not true at all. I don't want people to think that. However, one of the things that is interesting, and I find this very fascinating with people who are non-binary and things, that there is something I have found in my experience with people and magicians and students, that where magic comes from is from the energies, right? So the spirits, the earth, the sky, whatever. How we're able to tap into that energy is we have to get out of our boxes. We have to get out of this whole idea of this is right, this is wrong, this is up, this is down. And we're able to, what we say all the time in paganism and magic is, we have to walk between the worlds. And so, and I don't necessarily think, oh, two spirits are people who are non-binary or more powerful. I think that people who don't let gender norms define them necessarily are more open to the experience.
Yeah, I think that's very close to how I think about it too. I think about this. I know I'm dropping a lot of $3 academic terms, friends, and I will stop. But I think about this a lot in the term of liminality, which is this idea of, so it's based on the word for the thing around a doorway that holds the doorway in place, right? If there's a doorway and there's something on one side and there's something on the other side, I don't necessarily know that that's always true, but if there's a doorway, right, and you can manage to stand in the doorway rather than entirely on one side or the other, you're breaking a boundary, right? You're able to move through this place where energy happens. I think that in my understanding of ergi, which is really all I'm talking about, friends, like all of this is my context. Mileage may vary. Drive safely. Tip your bartender. Uh, it's very much about being able to look at boundaries, decide they are no longer useful to you, and break them in order to harness the energy there, right? That's also because I work with Loki, and like figuring out where the boundaries aren't useful and breaking them is what he does.
So it's interesting because I think the Iskan wrap us around to the whole thinking about the white heathen guy who keeps telling us we can't do this, can't do that. So in my Native American practice and in my traditional craft practice, there's something to be said about the left-hand path and the right-hand path. So the right-hand path is the path of community, of healing, of doing the right thing, and the right thing for your community. Like, it's very solar. Think of if I'm the a governor of a state, I have to do right by the community. That's why we have things like a law that says do not steal, do not kill. It's the correct thing, because some people need the rules. It's like the difference between morals and ethics. I don't have morals at all. I have ethics. Morals is rules by a higher power that says this is what you can and cannot do. Ethics says I choose for myself what I should and should not do, knowing fully well I'm human and I can screw things up. But anyway, so the idea of, I lost my train of thought here for a second. But anyway, so the idea of the left-hand path is, okay, well, shadow work, but not what New Age people say what shadow work is. And I think that's a good thing to do. Don't get me wrong. Shadow work is very powerful. When I mean shadow work, I mean going to the graveyard, talking spirits. That's what I'm talking about. And the reason we do that is because, and how I was trained in like traditional craft and things like that, is we don't make a big deal about it, because people who are not on path to shatter those boundaries aren't they're not there yet, and that's okay. It's not a judgment. That's where they are. They have other priorities. But for us, who's like, okay, let's tackle our fears. Let's tackle the dark, and I talk about this extensively in my underworld books about face your fears, face your drama, face your crap, because once you shatter that aspect of the ego, you opened yourself up to cross those boundaries, because according to your psyche at that point, you don't have a boundary that says keep your magic or keep your spirit in a box. It says, what's the potentiality? What can I do? And the thing is, once you get this, and to be honest, this is kind of advanced magic and stuff. Once you get there, what's the limitations? Well, that depends on you. And so, do you know, Luke, do you know anything about the ordeal path?
Yeah. I know. So my knowledge of the ordeal path comes out of the writings of Raven Caldera, who
absolutely.
is not my favorite author, but I find his not there. I am actually not sure of the pronouns that Raven uses right now, so I'm going to default to they, them. Suggests a path for spirit working specifically within the Norse tradition that sort of amalgamates a lot of different ways that people have approached spirit work in different cultures, including a lot that I don't know. Part of my problem with Raven is that he doesn't cite that. They don't cite that much. But my understanding of the ordeal path is specifically spirit work through pain that kicks you out of the body. I also know that that's because Raven works really, really clearly and like is very proud of the work within the BDSM community. I am not sure how the BDSM community feels about Raven, which I have heard is mixed, but.
So one of the things about the ordeal path, and actually they talk about this in the OTO and in chaos magic and other things like that. So some of the ideas, like for example, if you've ever done a sweat lodge before, or a Sundance or a Vision Quest, that is an ordeal. And what happens is, it's not so much painful as an, ow, this hurts. It's so much of it's it challenges your boundaries and your thresholds to push you a little over the edge, not over the cliff to cause you harm, but to challenge what your social norms are, your sexuality, your understanding of the universe, your understanding of left and right, so that it kind of shatters your ego so that your mind can expand. So, for example, there is, if you've ever been bound and blindfolded and swung around essentially a witch's cradle, the whole idea is to basically freak you out, scare you, so that your psyche goes, I'm going to fly out of my body. So if you're having a really hard time astral projecting, which you shouldn't because it's very simple, it rocks your mentality a little bit. And so it's the interesting about the leather community is that people who've even kind of studied it a little bit, it's not about sex at all. You know, does it happen? Sure. But it's more about, I haven't heard people say, oh, it's about trust. In surface, it's more about the exchange of energy. The exchange of energy. Some people call that a power dynamic, but it's a change of energy to where a lot of times it's really not about the dominant person, it's about the submissive person and putting them into an experience. And a lot of time it's a trance experience. I find it very interesting. The whole reason I bring this up is because in Sade, being passive, like for example, if you wanted to shatter your mentality, or well, not your mentality, but say your psyche just you have to put yourself into the other world, try something that you would normally feel is strange. So I can very much, and this is all conjecture, I can very much see heterosexual men putting themselves in women's clothes to expand their psyche. How do I actually think that happened? I don't know. I'm over here just ruminating on the experience because, like, for example, I can't tell you, well, they say this all the time, where there's fear, there's power,
Sure. I mean, I also think that and I've heard that argument before, right? I've heard of gender transgression as a way to unlock, as a way to break down the ego and unlock power. That being said, that's not how I approach it.
Thank you for saying that's not how I approach it either.
Right. As a trans person, I don't know what cis men are going to experience, and if it works for them, great, and I'm glad. But also, I really do not want to advocate for moving through trans space in order to get your cis power. I especially, what I am interested in, why I am here, why I am excited by this, is because it suggests to me that queer people are powerful because of who they are and in who they are, right? The act of being queer is a location of power, which in a society where that is not spoken about or seen to be the case. And again, I am not as familiar with the experiences of people of color. I am not speaking on behalf of any Native peoples, but white mainstream American culture does not see queerness as a strength. And being able to find specifically heathenry for me as a place where it is not only a strength, but it is a strength of the gods themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
That's where I want to locate this. and less in terms of like a thing that you can do in order to do something than like a thing that you are and that unlocks something for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that. It is that which you are that unlocks something. I'm going to remember that.
Yeah.
No, I think that's good. You know, one of the things I like to do for myself is I like to challenge myself. I like to um, uh, I like to do things that anyone tells me not to do. Like, for example, I have a stutter. So I can remember someone saying, "Oh, you can never speak publicly." Look what I do as a living. Hello. You know, and there's power through that. And I can remember being on stage as I would do plays, and I've done a little bit of modeling and this and that, and I've done dance shows and musical theater and stuff like that. And I can remember the first 3 or 4 times it was like devastating to where it was hard. And so, but I pushed through and I made myself do it. And through that ordeal, I found power, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that when we take our talents, you know, I do believe that. Well, first of all, I believe that all people are powerful. I believe that queer people are powerful, bisexual people, everybody. It just it depends how you choose to express that power. But when you take that power and you challenge yourself, that's when you're able to go deeper. You know, I don't know how many people have ever heard me say this. I actually don't believe in talent. I believe you gravitate towards something or you don't. But even that gravitation, so you have the cellist who at 5 years old can pick it up and, wow, that's my jam. You don't get to go to the symphony unless you practice your whole life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that what we have to do is take our power, because we all have power. One of the things that I like, and when I say ordeal path, I'm over here just guessing all the viewers are going, oh, so Chris is in a, what dark place is Chris at? But I'm also a big fan of the underworld, so I might be in a dark place. You never know. I could be in a crypt, I can be in a graveyard, mausoleum, you never know. But anyway, the idea is if you take your normal power, challenge yourself, expand yourself, you can go pretty deep. And I think that a lot of people, because of culture or how we grew up or bullying or misogyny or whatever happened, because a lot of people like to tell us don't have power, right? A lot of people like to say, oh, you're this or you're that, just like they told me, you can't possibly do that. And so they take our flame and they shrink it, you know. And I think that sometimes we have to shake ourselves up and bust through those energies of you can't, you shouldn't, or whatever.
Yeah. And I just am so struck with what Luke said about finding who you are is how you can generate that personal power. And it seems with what you're saying, Chris, is that so many people want to categorize who you are, and the discovery should be your own. Because in this, we've been talking a lot about sexuality, which I think is great, and how that affects paganism and heathenism and personal power. And that's been kind of a problem area for me because I am not a sexual person. You know, where does personal power form if you don't identify as a sexual person? And I even had a person tell me that I would never become a magician a powerful magician because I didn't practice sex magic.
Oh, that's
So here's,
gross. I can't
and
with that. Oh my God.
we're just all jumping.
But the reason
go
I
ahead.
bring it up is that I was so struck by what Luke said, because it's about coming to who you are and owning that within yourself and not needing anyone else to have a category for you. Because I was listening to all this discussion and I'm like, yes, I know what the leather scene is. Yes, I know what BDSM is. I don't know it because I've read about it. I know it because I've been in it. Thank you. But that's not who I am. And it wasn't until I understood within my own self that I am not a sexual person, that was when my magic was able to go forward, is claiming my own self and who I am.
And I think that's exactly, and I know that we're short on time. That's
Oh
exactly
no,
what I've been trying to.
keep going.
And I know that's I think that's exactly what I wanted to say. And you said it so beautifully. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
In that, like, all of this it is easy to conflate sex and sexuality. And it's easy to think like, oh, gay people have power, therefore I will have gay sex and there will be power. But like, it's actually like everybody's edge is somewhere different. Everybody's truth is somewhere different. And I think that you're absolutely right in that, like, finding what it is to be true to yourself and pushing there so that you can continue to do it and do it in bigger and braver ways is where the power is. Some people need to like do that in like super intense ways, but like the awesome experience of like recognizing like, hey, I'm like not like your word is like not a sexual person. I'm not a sexual person. This doesn't really have power for me. Gives you so much more ability to like spend time and energy on the things that do.
Yeah.
That's so awesome. And that's such a good way of saying it.
You know, one of the things that I used to talk about with colleagues and people is about sexuality in pagan circles and things, because you know, a lot of times in Wicca, it's, you know, the god and the goddess, and how spring happens. This is, they have a divine sexuality, and I think there's some power in that, but I am not a fan at all of public displays of, like, I don't like skyclad. I've done it for ceremonies. It's not my thing. And someone goes, "Oh, it's because you don't know how to be free." I'm like, spend a weekend with me. I'll show you freedom.
I know freedom. I know it. Trust me. I'm not doing skyclad. I'm not doing it. So.
And I also think that, like, I think that part of that comes out of the history of Gerald Gardner. And part of that, like, part of that is based on like older ideas of binary sexuality and binary gender and binaries that just aren't true. Like, there's no space in there. I've been to those circles. There's no space in there to have a non-binary identity. There's no space in there to be intersex. Like, to the point that some of the language used in older magical practices is really like painful stuff for a lot of people now. Like, there's this idea of the divine androgen, right? Which I think many people find very like powerful, especially in like older ceremonial magic circles. But like, it doesn't actually interact with the lived experience of people who like exist outside of the binary. Also, the binary is fake and a social construct, and like
do think that
Um,
there is some meaning there because, I mean, it is a way to codify things and to create categories. I mean,
sure.
I mean, we even give binary assignments to some languages, and I don't think that having categories is necessary, but you do have to embrace that, yes, there are these categories. There's always going to be things that fall outside of those categories.
Well, and I think that,
Because
yeah,
I think the heterosexual community gets a lot of negativity now that I don't necessarily think they deserve.
well, and I think that, like, and thank you for calling me on that. I think that the point that I'm actually trying to make is that those categories are there because we made them.
Yeah.
And that while they have a lot of power because they have been encoded in language and discourse for hundreds of years, that while we're talking about, right, while we're talking about like trying to identify where you are, right, and who you are and the truest version of you, it's important to keep in mind that those categories are not naturally occurring. They are things that are imposed by the culture. And my nods to Amanda in the comment section who brought up the point about naturalness. They are things that occur in the culture, and they are
Sure.
things that,
Yes.
and like all categories, they can box you in
Yeah.
as much as they can give you power.
Well, see, I think that's wrapping this back to what we were initially talking about.
We're over here in
No, this is great. But just like you said, boxing people in, like for example, boxing people into a pagan circle, you have to do skyclad, or a pagan circle that it is about the sexuality between the male and the female, and that's it, and there's no room for variation, or the boxing of an heathenry of you have to do it this way, this way, this way, or my personal favorite, and I was told this, and I think Luke, you and I we talked about this before about don't mention Loki's name and who Loki. Oh my God, stop! That's so silly. That's so silly. Break those barriers, because if you do and call him, I bet you he's gonna say, "I'm gonna show you some power here that you're gonna enjoy." I mean, granted, it is Loki, so I'd be like, "You first," but still. But
I mean, listen, if we want to talk just about Loki for an hour sometime, just call
yeah, do it.
just like drop me a line,
Yeah.
like send up the signal. I will just show up at your front door. But
Well,
like also, huh?
I was going to say, but my point is that all these establishments who try to put you in boxes, and let me say, the majority of them don't put you in a box because they're trying to hurt us or trying to repress us. I think a lot of them are short-sightedness, and they don't understand the greater ramifications. Because I don't think that when people say, yeah, granted, I'm not talking about queerness or queer spaces. I'm talking about when people like, oh, let's go skyclad, and that's the rule because it experiences our freedom. I think the intent behind that is show your freedom, but we also have to remember the history behind that intent. That intent came out in 1945, which was completely repressive, and for someone to go outside and celebrate the summer solstice naked was a huge, that's an ordeal path, because it's 1945. I could go to jail, I could lose my job, you still could go to jail if you're out in the
About to say, you still you can still go to jail if you're practicing skyclad in the right place.
It's a bigger deal, so that, if you think about it, is an ordeal path, and I think the intent had a magical purpose. Now I don't think it has a purpose. I mean, for those people who enjoy that, I think that's fine. But for people who don't need that purpose, like for example, when the same person goes, "Oh, Chris, you don't know how to let yourself go," I'm like, "With me, you have a good time." But because I don't need to take off my clothes in public to show people I'm free. I'm free here and I'm free here. I don't need to take off my clothes. However, but what I'm saying is that I think there was at the time they thought a good reason. Now we don't need that reason to expand our psyche and our magic.
And I think that when we're talking about things like this specifically, you're right. It wasn't imposed because people are trying to do damage, right? I think that for me, magic is contextual.
Mm-hmm.
It is about what makes the power happen for you and how you understand the power and how you access the power.
Yes.
But humans our brains are lazy. We like having patterns. We like having set rules. We like not having to think about them that much. So as the rule gets passed down and encoded, it doesn't become, I want to be uncomfortable and access my power, so I'm going to get naked because that makes me specifically very uncomfortable, and that makes me able to do my power better. It becomes, you get naked to do magic, cause that's the rule about how you do magic. You get naked to do it. And like, if you're not continually like examining your practice, then it's easy to get those rules handed to you and be like, oh, so I need Bethany to make this spell. Great. Where the hell do I buy some Bethany? When really it's about like what Bethany is and what it did for the person who wrote the spell down. Right? So in that way, I think you're right. There are other categories that have been encoded that I think were put in for specifically bad reasons and specifically to do harm. And I want to make a differential between those things.
So
Like,
give me an example about what you mean, because I think I know, but I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting.
race.
Yeah.
Yeah, like race is a fake thing that we created in about 1600. My dates are off. 1400 is when it shows up as an idea for the first time. 1600 it shows up in actual like written American laws. In those time frames. Before that time, it did not exist. People did not understand people to exist as races. It was put in place specifically so that the like capitalist system of slave labor in America could work. That's why it exists.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I didn't come here to talk about critical race theory, but here we are. Like, that is an example of a category that was put in place specifically to cause harm to people, that has been encoded and passed down, and we are stuck with now. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's real now. And that gives us, and I think to your earlier point, Chris, that gives us the job of figuring out what it means to be a good white person, because it was not originally an idea to be a good white person. White people were created to create slavery. And that's part of the history. So when we talk about like making heathenry safer and more accessible to people of color, and doing the work, and yeah, I will, if you want sources on this, Ta-Nehisi Coates is an amazing resource for this sort of research. There's actually a book that I am reading right now called The History of White People, that goes into a lot of like of this. There's also a book called Bound from the Beginning. But like, as we're talking about heathen spaces and like making pagan spaces accessible to people of color, one of the things that we have to do is look at our categories, look at the rules we have in place, and ask where they came from, why they're here, and what they're doing. And I think for me, to tie us all together, that is the work that heathenry is in the middle of right now.
Yep.
And the work that is for me very much tied to like religious practice in heathenry. is that work of when you see something, say something, and let your enemy know no peace, right? You gotta actively work to make spaces better. So that's my soapbox for tonight.
I have to say, like a week ago, I joined the Trough, and I was actually very impressed because as soon as I went to their website, because I have some books from them. I followed Diana Paxton and things like that. Um, I went to the website, and on their cover was a pride flag, a trans flag, and stuff like that. And the first thing they said is, because I was actually impressed, because they're trying to clean their own backyard too. Um, they made it very clear. First page, we have no tolerance for racism, anti-trans, anti-this. If this is you, don't join us. And I was like, wow, that was very impressive, because a lot of groups, they'll clean their own backyard privately, but not publicly. Meaning, and I'm trying to understand that process, because a lot of times is you don't carry out your own dirty laundry in front of people, but in this case, I want the world to know this is a safe space, and I think there's so much power in that. And I was actually very impressed. I was like, oh my God, that's amazing.
That's one of the reasons I joined the Trough. Like the Trough is at the forefront, I think, of this practice in American heathenry called inclusive heathenry, which is very clear about we include all of these people in our practice. We do not discriminate based on these things. They, like I said, I think that they're the best group out there in America today. That is my personal 2 cents there. And like all of us, like nobody's perfect. We all have problems to clean up in our backyard. And I do want to say that, like, I realize that I am a little bit further on some scales than other people, when I'm saying, like, not only do we have to be inclusive, we have to actively work inside of our own spaces to examine our structures and see why we are the way we are and if we can be better. Because it's not just everybody can be here, it's parts of who we are may not be safe for everybody right now. Let's figure out what those are and work on them.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay. Well, I have to thank you. You guys were awesome per usual. Lou, thank you so much. I love everything about you. Just saying. Ruby Rose, thank you. Oh my God, so much. You guys made me so excited about this. It's like, I can't wait till Saturday. It's almost Saturday. I love Saturday. But anyway, I'm going to stop the recording and just open it up to questions. I will say it's already an hour and a half. This is the longest show, but oh my God, I could do this all day. Well, we have stuff to do, so I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much for joining us.